Hello you lovely lot, and welcome to Tuesday's Daily Rundown with me, Paul Burgess. Tonight we're going to chat about all the big news stories that will be lining our chip paper tomorrow, and some of the smaller stories too. Coming up tonight, BBC wages, new HIV medicine and a plastic bag update. But before all of that, let me introduce our guests who will be taking all the news apart with insight and possibly a little bit of attitude. Our first guest, co-founder of the Open Intelligence think tank, it's Loz Kaye.
Good evening, good to be here on the Bonket of News once again.
It's great to have you back. And our other guest, writer for the Jewish media agency, it's David Semple.
Howdy, nice to be back.
It's good to have you both with us. Don't forget, if you fancy getting involved with the show tonight, you can always tweet us at The Daily Rundown. And if you don't fancy getting in touch, well, that's just lovely. Thanks a lot. We still like you, though. First story, shall we start?
Yes,
and then we can start ripping
in.
it to pieces. Major cities in England, particularly Manchester, have seen the sharpest falls in home ownership since the early 2000s. The Resolution Foundation said homes are increasingly unaffordable for struggling potential buyers. The proportion of homeowners dropped from 72% in April 2003 to 58% this year in Greater Manchester. It's believed one of the main causes is that since 2003, wages have been unable to keep up with housing prices. So it is not simply that house prices have risen, wages have stagnated and fallen. The average first-time buyer paid under £30,000 for a new home in the 80s, compared with more than £150,000 in 2016. Guys, you've seen this in the news, no doubt. What are your thoughts?
Well, the first thing is that those figures are pretty startling when you first look at them. Particularly for the Greater Manchester, seeing that extraordinary kind of fall in home ownership, and it certainly looks like the end of that old Thatcher ideal of being a kind of home owning democracy. That's which I think is really so interesting that's happened under the kind of the coalition in this government. But then the question is, well. You poke a little bit more at this story and say, well, does this matter and what's going on? I mean, that's the kind of question. There's also, particularly when you look at Greater Manchester, well, it's not surprising that home ownership's gone down when there's actually, when in terms of proportionately, there's actually more properties which are rental properties instead of being sold. So that's one. So it's not quite as clear cut as you'd first think, this story. But the big thing is about the affordability question, and that's the kind of the key. It kind of seems to me that essentially people are kind of struggling there, and also the policies that are being brought forward that are supposed to tackle that particularly the government's Help to Buy scheme. Now, actually, over 3 years, about some 3,700 people were helped to buy a home in Greater Manchester, which sounds like, ooh, great, okay, that's a lot. But then you think that the population of Greater Manchester is 2.8 million. So saying that this really is clearly whatever's happening, that policy isn't making an impact on the figures overall.
Obviously another thing is there was a peak generation that owned their own homes who are dropping dead, leaving their properties to other people, and they're just selling them off. And then private landlords are coming in and buying those properties. Because I've been involved in politics, I've seen how the landscape of like North Manchester, for instance, is changing. And where Granny used to live, you've got new people living there, and they're renting. They don't own the place. And one of the reasons I think is that we have a law in Australia. There's a law that says you can only own, if you're from another country, one property, or you can't buy property in the country. In this city, multiple properties are bought by people who live way overseas, from the other end of the earth to Europe and everywhere. And those people buying those multiple properties all on mortgages. They're not coming in with big cash and buying them. They're all getting mortgages from the banks. And then suddenly they go bust, they don't pay anymore. And I noticed this a few years ago. And then some guy has to sell the flats again on the market. they have driven the prices of the properties up. They're probably higher than they should be in Manchester. So Manchester income is lower than London. The properties should be cheaper here. But the fact that there's a lot of, I hate to say it, overseas ownership of the properties, keeping the prices up because they're buying them as an investment. And that's going to get worse now because there's tons of people from other countries and like a certain country that was going to buy into the Hinkley thing, talking about building high-rises in Manchester, changing the landscape of the city.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's certainly in terms of you see there's a lot of building going on at the moment, and that's one of the things that seems really sort of paradoxical about this story, is that there's another kind of big wave of building that's happened. I mean, obviously there was the crash in 2008, which stopped a lot of development. But we seem to be getting into a really strange position now because, as David said, prices are being pressed up, but there's also, even the idea of what's affordable is like even the government's kind of changed that to a certain extent. Is that there's new categories of things that are supposedly affordable. So there's starter homes, but actually some of those in London it's like £450,000 for £450,000, which is like 17 times the average wage. And this is supposedly affordable, but so I think Great Manchester, but other cities, Sheffield and Leeds, for example, are possibly looking at a situation where we're going down the route of London, and I think that's something we want to avoid. But council's been putting forward policies saying, affordable housing is important, and also already the Labour mayoral candidates are banging on about that. But actually, they've got very little.
The empty properties the council owns across the city, like in Ancoats and Clayton and other places, with the whole streets of empty properties they haven't developed.
Yeah, well, there's actually kind of getting less leeway with that. It's certainly true that there are streets that are empty, but it's also even then the question about where does the investment come in to do that up, and that you can still make that an affordable housing. That's the question. That seems to me like the policies aren't there to be able to kind of deal with this issue.
Do you think people are you mentioned something quite interesting, David, about people owning property from abroad?
Yeah.
I've had personal experience of this.
I have friends from abroad who own properties here.
Well, Oldham, which is where I'm from, is going through this big spate of regeneration at the moment, and apparently there are a lot of properties on Yorkshire Street, which is a big street in Oldham, which are owned by people who now live abroad, and the council are trying to buy back off them so that they can use them as shops and things. On the other side of that, do you think that people are buying abroad more? I mean, you see these programs like A Place in the Winter Sun, and you see these stunning beachfront apartments for what you'd get a two-bed terraced for in kind of Limeside or Hollingwood or Ancoats maybe.
Obviously some people move overseas. A friend of mine used to work at the BBC, lives in the south of France now. He loves it there, right? He's about my age. But I think what we've got here is we need to restrict the amount of the properties that people who aren't British citizens and who don't live here can own, and that way prices will suddenly level off, and that will be a start. I mean, there's other schemes we can talk about too. What do you think?
Well, that's certainly one thing to look at, but it's also, I think it's also putting pressure on kind of the local level as well, in terms of also that there's actually, there is money, but it's a small amount of money that's going towards supporting housing, and I think we ought to talk about the different types of schemes that you should be able to open up. And I think, for example, in Great Manchester, some of that has been misapplied really, because under the devolution deal for Great Manchester, there is actually money for housing, but already that's going into supporting developments by developers like Peel, who aren't short of a bob or two.
Right.
So I think that's the question it's not enough money to make a massive difference, but also
and
we
are
should
these Peel
start
properties cheap?
Yeah. Well, no, but it's also at least that's a place to start.
Yeah.
And I think that and I think I'm really surprised that also that Tony Lloyd, who is the interim mayor of Greater Manchester, is going along with that. And I think that there's not a moment to say, hang on a minute, we need to stop this because we're heading down a route that we don't want to. I'll be very surprised if we get kind of more laws in terms of restricting overseas ownership. But also, I think we need to be thinking about actually putting into practice some of the plans that are already there. It's like these things that kind of a dime a dozen. These plans that say, well, of course we want affordable housing and sustainable development in our area. There's not a local development plan that doesn't say that. But also, when it comes down to the planning, that also then that's not a reason to refuse planning, because I've seen it time and again in Manchester. Is then when it comes up and say, is there any affordable housing in this? No, we couldn't afford to do that with the building if there was. Oh right, okay, sorry. Well, we still want houses. Then go ahead. That's the problem.
Just before we go to the break, I have to mention, only because I've got quite a few friends who are kind of in the market at the moment, and they're finding that the most difficult thing is the deposit. Because it's a huge amount of money to have to kind of save up beforehand, and I think maybe that's something that something that the authorities have helped with it. But we could talk about that for hours, but we're not going to, because we're going to have a quick break. But the three of us will be back in just a few minutes. Make sure you stick right around. You're watching the Daily Rundown on Channel 7.